Getting on the bus, it's a simple act, without controversy. The ability for everyone to sit anywhere on a bus or in a restaurant is one that's taken for granted today. But it wasn't always like that.
All the whites got on the bus first. Many times the drivers were discourteous, and of course you went to the back of the bus.
And the white schools, on the other hand, they had buses long before we did. They'd ride by us and spit on us as we walked back and forth to school.
When I got out of Vietnam, came back to the States, and was going through Georgia, you just couldn't buy gas.
We rode on the Seaboard airline train, and we had to carry our lunch because we were not allowed to eat in the dining car. And down at the train depot, they had a side for the coloreds and a side for the whites, and that's what it was called, coloreds and whites. And we were on the colored side.
Before transportation and public facilities were integrated, cities in Southwest Florida were divided along racial lines. Up until the late 1960s, African Americans were forbidden from patronizing many restaurants, theaters, and hotels. Change would come, but when and how? It was in 1961 when a handful of Americans, black and white, boarded buses north of the Mason-Dixon line, determined to test segregation laws as they rode into the Deep South. Lehigh Acres resident Mel Toadvine witnessed one of the first tests while working as a reporter in Maryland. He'd gotten a tip that a group of Freedom Riders would be visiting a local restaurant before heading further south.
The bus pulled up. White and black students got off, maybe 40, 50 kids, walked into the grill, sat down at the booze and at the bar, and they served them. Nobody looked, nobody did a thing. It was just as natural as anything. And I'm sitting there in amazement because I thought there might be some problems because we had a few extremists in Salisbury, but they probably were not in the restaurant that night. But they were there for 15 or 20 minutes, ate a meal, got up, walked out, got on the bus and went on. And the next morning when I went back to the paper, the editor came over and said, "What happened last night?" And I said, "Nothing." He said, "Really? You didn't get out?" "Nope, I sat in the car." He said, "Oh, okay." So he wrote an editorial in that day's paper, and the headline read, "Salisbury was integrated last night."
Few integration efforts came so easily. When the Freedom Riders entered the Deep South, including Florida, they faced harassment, arrests, and mob violence. It was a pivotal time in the long struggle for equality and was soon followed by measures that dismantled racial barriers all over the South. Away from the center of attention, places like Fort Myers, Punta Gorda, and Naples went about their own efforts. It was far from a smooth ride.
When I was at Dunbar School, I felt like, even if I felt like I wasn't as smart as anybody else, I mean, at least we all looked the same and nobody treated me like an outcast or made me feel like I wasn't supposed to be there.
The racism, by the time I got back in the late 60s here, was a little more subtle, although I'm sure the black folks in the Dunbar community didn't think it was so subtle.
Just told them, Reverend Edwards and whoever else was with him, to look over there, and there were people with baseball bats and all that, and he said he wasn't going to be able to protect them if they marched downtown.
What was it like to be forced to get up and move because strangers wanted your seat? To be denied service at most restaurants, hotels, and theaters? Even a walk on the wrong beach would invite trouble. Southwest Florida is home to some civil rights pioneers who were on the front lines of the struggle. They were witnesses and participants in key places where events laid the groundwork for the civil rights movement: Greensboro, North Carolina, Nashville, Tennessee, and Birmingham, Alabama. Like many other places in the South, the road to equality in Southwest Florida would be a long ride home.
When the students decided to demonstrate in Birmingham, Alabama, and the Bull County, for an instance, turned loose the hoses on the students. It was an awesome time an awesome sight to watch.
We had been organized to go to Cross Keys one afternoon, and nobody had any idea that we were going to go to jail. And as a matter of fact, the interesting thing is I didn't have any money in my pocket if I was permitted to eat, and I was not by myself.
In fact, I think the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee got its start in North Carolina when, on February 1st, 1960, 4 students from A&T University in Greensboro, which is a historically black college, launched a sit-in at a Woolworth's lunch counter. And that started the sit-ins. And this action seems so simple. I remember thinking about it at the time. I was in about the 6th or 7th grade, I think. And a group of us were walking downtown, and we just decided to go in and sit in at the lunch counter at Woolworth's.
When Jacqueline Hubbard was growing up in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, she enjoyed a tight-knit community that instilled a sense of pride and dignity. When she and a few grade school classmates spontaneously decided to join a burgeoning movement, it set the tone for a life of activism. Now the chief litigator for Collier County, Hubbard's college years at Bryn Mawr included a deep involvement in the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, which had its origins in nearby Raleigh.
After I graduated from high school, my parents gave me a choice of, did I want to take a trip to Europe, or did I want them to pay for an apartment for me in Washington, D.C. for the summer? And I said, no, I don't want to do either one of those things. I want to work in a SNCC project in Newark. No, it wasn't scary at all. It was exhilarating. It was wonderful. You felt as if you were making a contribution that was worthwhile, and Bryn Mawr encouraged political activity. For instance, if we wanted to go to the march in Washington, which we did, they got the bus for us to go. Now remember, these were really young people. And the thing is that a lot of the movement itself in the early 60s was done by very young people. I mean, high school students, you know, in a lot of the cities. They filled up the jails. They were very young.
I was the youth chapter of James Island for the NAACP. And, you know, there are things that you question that existed that was not right. And instinctively, every human being knows what's fair or what's unfair. Just so some people don't have the moral commitment to want to make some changes.
David Richardson grew up in Charleston, South Carolina, where there was a large community of support. A part-time Punta Gorda resident, he remembers how his family's shrimp business helped to teach him about independence at an early age.
I first went to sea at 8 and became a deckhand at 12. So growing up in an environment where, you know, the sea is the only thing that you feel respect, then everybody else that you dealt with in the ocean that was shrimpers, whether white or black, you're equal.
Back on land, Richardson had to endure segregation on buses and in restaurants. While studying law in 1960 at Fisk University, he participated in the historic lunch counter protests to force integration of facilities in downtown Nashville.
And we all were taken downtown to the jail and spent the Thanksgiving day in a cell. I think we got out maybe that Friday or Saturday, I don't remember exactly, but we spent about 2 or 3 days in cell. And one of my cellmates was John Lewis, who's now a congressman from Georgia.
My experiences, it was partially a southern battle, but it was also in the north as well. For an instance, in Gary, Indiana, you still had segregation. In Gary, Indiana, blacks couldn't get jobs at grocery stores and other places where they were patronizing the business, maybe 90 or 100%, but there were no black clerks. So that's one of the reasons why we organized the Fair Share organization and started picketing against the Kroger Company and against other local establishments because they wouldn't hire blacks, even for clerks.
Hilbert Brantley was a lawyer who fought for civil rights in Gary and elsewhere for 60 years. Born in Birmingham, Alabama, he served in the Army during World War II before becoming the first African American to attend Valparaiso University School of Law in Indiana. Beginning in the late 1950s, Bradley and his group held meetings that were attended by major civil rights figures like Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Kelly Miller Smith. He has been a seasonal resident of Naples for over 20 years and moved there full-time since retiring in 2010, giving the 91-year-old attorney time to reflect.
We were not only fighting for African Americans, we were fighting for the nation. We were fighting for equal rights and equal opportunities. We felt that there was an advantage to have all races and all classes and all types of people involved, because there's something to be gained from diversity.
Well, during that time I was very young, in the 50s. You can feel it wasn't right, but I really didn't understand how wrong it was until in '68 when I left and went to Atlanta and was able to go into front doors of restaurants and drink from fountains that didn't have color about them. That's when I really understood that segregation was not right.
And my mother was a person who took no second seat to anybody, neither did my father, so it's very natural for us.
I enjoyed the segregated environment I was in, to tell you the truth. I felt very protected there. I didn't really know any different.
I guess I grew up hearing stories and knowing, what was possible. When I grew up here, the street that we're on now, which is MLK Boulevard, was Cochran Street. And believe it or not, this was a business district, and people would come from Fort Myers and Arcadia, Bartow, Sarasota, and come here on the weekends to go to the clubs that we had here. So when I grew up, it was really a pretty lively kind of place. I thought it was pretty good. In this community, as a child, I felt very cared about, very protected. People in this community cared about each other. They shared work, they shared food. If you caught a bunch of fish, you'd give some to your neighbor. If you were growing some greens, you'd share those with your neighbor.
One result of segregation was the bonding that took place in African American communities throughout the country. Schools, stores, restaurants, hotels, clubs, and many other businesses were created to fill the void. There were many thriving communities, like the one in Punta Gorda during Martha Beretta's youth. But leaving that comfort zone was a difficult endeavor.
I actually characterize travel for blacks during that period as being, one, very inconvenient, very humiliating, and it was anxiety-ridden. My father's family lived in Virginia, so we did take the train. We caught the train out here. We were in a separate coach out here. Of course, if you go by the Punta Gorda, the old train station, you'll see that there were separate waiting rooms. There was a colored side and a white side, and actually a wall that separated the colored and white side.
I can recall having to travel from this side of the water by bus to the ferry, the other side bus to probably about 30 miles to East Fort Myers, where I went to school at Dunbar, which was segregated. And of course we had to ride separate buses from the white children. And of course we couldn't ride the same ferry with them.
Lynn Gavin grew up on Sanibel Island as part of a large family and remembers the segregated facilities off and on the island. In a town where his nephew now owns a restaurant, he recalls being treated differently in another time.
I had a brother who was a cook at one of the restaurants here, and even though he was a cook at the restaurant, we, his brothers, knew he could come through the front door to get hamburgers, and we often went there for hamburgers, went to the back door.
I felt like I was an outcast, shoved in the back corner. It seemed like nobody wanted to help me out. I was intimidated.
I had a class of 42 children at that time.
Biggest impact or story that I can remember was some of the riots at Cypress Lake High School.
Schools were the most obvious form of discrimination. Facilities for blacks in Southwest Florida were neglected and poorly equipped, but they managed to achieve remarkable results.
We had resources, but not as white schools did, because a lot of things they always were talking about. Books were, you know, we got these books and that thing from the whites and all of that, but we managed, and many of the school teachers took their funds and bought things that our children needed, pencils, paper, and we helped out. Others helped out too.
I always say I enjoyed going to a segregated school, but I just think that we should have had the same opportunity to get educated as the whites had. Good teachers, and we had excellent teachers, but give them the material that they needed in order to educate us. We have had doctors, lawyers, you name it, have come from Dunbar High School, so it's not that we got an inferior education, we just had inferior material.
Change came to Lee County in 1964 when the newly built Sanibel Elementary welcomed an integrated class, the first for Lee County School District. But the Gavins, a remarkable family of 18 children who all grew up on Sanibel Island, felt some discomfort when they got over to the mainland.
Thank goodness we came from a large family, because when I got to Cyprus, I had no problems. I mean, you say, oh, you want the Gavins? Yeah, you get a free pass on whatever. I had a problem, I go to my older brother Oscar, or Larry, or whichever one, and say, hey, so-and-so's giving me a hard time. And I never had to worry about it again, but I know a lot of other minority kids didn't have that luxury.
I love Sanibel Elementary School. I had some good times there. Once we got to Cypress Lake Middle, kind of changed, you know. It wasn't, you know, we weren't hanging out together every day, and they found new friends and, you know, went their way. And a lot of times we passed each other in the hall, and like I would speak and they were with their friends and they wouldn't speak back, you know, and stuff like that, you know. And that's when you realize, you know, it was a big change. But we still had to ride the same bus back to Sanibel's.
Nobody made an issue of race or anything like that. And so to tell you the truth, I really didn't understand any difference. We were able to go in the front doors of places and things like that. So I didn't have that experience on Sanibel.
Some Gavins only attended segregated schools in Lee County, some only integrated schools, some both. Each has his own story. For Eric, the youngest, his idyllic view of the world changed when he held hands with a white girl while walking to class at Cypress Lake Middle School.
Well, some of the other kids who came from the Fort Myers community had different experiences in their schools than what we had. So once we all mixed together, they were very uncomfortable with my situation with my friend, and they let it be known. And that probably was the most harsh racial discrimination experience that I've ever had in my life.
My mother and father, I believe, laid a foundation for the things that would have come as far as integration, because they taught us our place and they taught us how to exercise wisdom. I've learned in the last 20-some years to always exercise wisdom and don't cut your own throat to spite your face. And I think that was one of the things that we had to learn, because it was an isolated island and the people that we worked for may have had some different ideas about race relations.
The primary motivation makes you feel that if I do something that's damaging, then the next person who comes along who is an African American, his problems would be even worse than mine. So I'm going to do a good job. But there's a lot of pressure naturally.
First thing that they would say is that that's the law. It has nothing to do with what's right or wrong or morality.
I looked around until I didn't see anybody coming, and I took a sip of the white water. Well, the only difference was the white water was cold and the colored water was not cold.
When I left the bus station, Trailway bus station, and went to Miami, and went to the Belmont Hotel. When I left there and went to induction center, the sergeant said, "This ends your separation. You sit where you wanna, you go where you wanna, and when you get on the plane, you can sit where you wanna."
The late 1960s was a period of massive upheaval in the United States. Protests, assassinations, riots, war. The small town of Fort Myers was facing the civil rights battle in its own way. Days after the assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in 1968, there was a memorial service at the Fort Myers Exhibition Hall. The first time blacks were welcome there.
When we opened up the exhibition hall for the meeting, there were some objections. People didn't want us to do that, but that's understandable. Well, there are always a few knuckles that won't come along, you know. Most of the right people would change and grow as it changes. There were some that wanted to keep them over on the other side of the track, always something like that. Want them on one side and us on the other side, but we took the tracks out.
When her father was mayor, Jenny Henderson was part of the first real integration of public schools. In the fall of 1969, all 7th graders in Lee County, black and white, attended one of 2 integrated schools.
Yeah, things were kind of turbulent, I guess, the first few weeks of school, and well, all through the school year, but mostly certain kids would be picked on. There would always be a fight near a locker, you know, because there weren't teachers there to watch, I guess.
The guy Ray Rhodes, he's one of the islanders, one of the 300-pound islanders, and I'd gone in the bathroom and I was cornered by about 5 or 6 white guys that were calling me names and giving me a hard time. And Ray Rhodes walked in there and saw what was going on, and he just went through all of them and just gave all of them a good shellacking. And he told them, he said, "If you ever touch Oscar Gavin again," he said, "I'll kill all of y'all."
I knew it would happen one day. I knew that it was coming. I knew it was coming. I did not like the busing situation, but there was nothing I could do about it because I was a working parent, so I had no other choice but to have them ride the bus.
Lee Melzick grew up on Fort Myers Beach, but left the area after graduating from Fort Myers High School in 1963, when it was all white. He returned in the late 1960s and worked as a reporter for 32 years at the Fort Myers News Press. In that time, Melzick wrote numerous investigative articles on how racism persisted long after segregation ended.
There have been a lot of changes. I think we've grown up a lot since those days. But I've been retired now for 6 years, and right up until the end of my time at the news press, I continued to see glimpses of the bigotry that existed, the kind of bigotry that existed back in the 60s.
I'm so glad I'm fighting for my rights. I'm so glad.
Have a long way to go, but it's much better than it was. So we have to say, thank you, Lord, for that. I do thank you.
Much has changed in Southwest Florida over the last 50 years. The population has exploded and diversified. The issues that once bitterly divided people seem unimaginable now. The major strides made by civil rights pioneers from another generation make some wonder what great challenges are left. Others see much more work to be done. The battle over segregation may have run its course, but there are still those who remember the long ride home.
I've learned that you have to clean up your side of the street, so don't always blame somebody else for the way things are. Do what you can to change things.
When you're that young, you have the energy and you don't have the background of being downtrodden. You really believe you can make change. You feel it.
I can remember for the first leg of the trip, my mother would make, she'd roast chicken and make chicken sandwiches, and we'd have coconut cake. And then overnight we did eat in that little section that they had for blacks. We could eat, have a meal there.
I can remember when we were traveling in the car, we could not stop to restrooms and you couldn't stop to get food or whatever. I can remember those kind of things because we always had and we laugh about this now, the shoebox lunch. In your shoebox lunch, you had fried chicken and pound cake, and you had some water to take with you.
I felt uncomfortable when I finished basic training and I became a training instructor, and 75 white young men was in that command and I had to be in charge. But the sergeant told me and the captain said, you just take command. We back you up. And that was true throughout my career.
I never dreamed that I would have what we have now. Never dreamed that I would be living in a gated community. Never dreamed that we'd have a swimming pool, that I'd be able to walk out the front door, jump in the pool now. Beyond my wildest dreams.